Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Watson, co-chair for this year's Women's Health and Cancer Conference and a radiologist at the University of Vermont Cancer Center and assistant professor at the University of Vermont. On behalf of my partner co-chair, physician assistant in medical oncology, Jordan Tolstoy, I welcome you and am pleased to introduce today's webinar, Let Food Be Thy Medicine, Practical Ways to Up Your Nutrition Game. Our dynamic duo presenters today are Leah Pryor, Executive Chef of the UVM Medical Center, and Dr. Kim Dittus, UVM Assistant Professor of Medicine and Medical Oncologist, Researcher, and Medical Director of Oncology Rehabilitation Steps to Wellness at the UVM Cancer Center. Their collective passion for food, nutrition, and support for cancer survivors and cancer prevention drives a strong collaborative spirit to bring education to our community. Thank you, Leah and Kim. Before we begin, I want to share a few housekeeping items. We are taping today's session, so it will be accessible later to the public, and that information will be emailed to participants as well as posted to the Cancer Center website. Credits are offered for live participation only, however. Thank you for submitting questions ahead of time. Our presenters have incorporated those questions into their presentations. You can also submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and our presenters will do their best to get to those at the end of their presentation. Lastly, I want to be sure to thank our presenting sponsor, the Victoria Buffum Fund at the UVM Cancer Center, as well as the Eleanor B. Daniels Fund at the UVM Cancer Center, and the many of you who donated when you registered to help keep programming like this free and accessible. Thank you again for joining us. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Kim Dittus.
Hello, and I'm really excited to be here talking about one of my favorite subjects, and that is food. And so many years ago, Hippocrates said, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." So that's been so long ago that you'd think that we would have had all the food issues figured out, but we don't. And that's because making food changes is not easy, but it can be done. And so I think it's important to not acknowledge those challenges up front. So next slide. So how does diet and our food choices affect whether we develop cancer and how we do if we have cancer? So this is a slide that depicts the top modifiable risk factors for developing cancer. And you'll notice at the top, smoking, but then if you notice the stars by excess weight and poor dietary habits, that accounts for 25% of modifiable risk factors that contribute to developing cancer. So obviously our food choices are important. Next slide. So both food and diet are four-letter words. And so I think it's important to define what we're talking about, at least to begin with. So food, broadly, is the material consisting essentially of protein, carbohydrate, and fat that's used in the body to sustain growth, repair, and for vital processes, as well as to furnish energy. And that's from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. And there's this adage that's frequently talked about, that there is no such thing as bad food. And I'm not so sure that that's really the case. Next slide. So let's continue to define terms a little bit. So processed food is considered the raw agricultural commodities that are available. And then they've been subjected to things like washing and cleaning, cutting, chopping, and many other things that alter the food from its natural state to some extent. And that's a long U.S. Department of Agriculture definition. But if you see on the bottom, there is a wide range of food processing in terms of a continuum. So you can start out with strawberries that are washed and then maybe sliced and frozen, and that's processing to some extent, and then putting it into a plastic jar so that you can eat it easily, and maybe a frozen fruit bar that has some fruit juice. And at the way end, you end up with some gummy fruit snack that has a pinch of strawberry in it. And so it's that less processed to more processed, somewhere in there, food starts to become not such a healthy choice. But there are definitely food choices or minimally processed foods that are good for us. Leah, next slide, Leah can tell you more about that.
All right, hello everybody. Just wanted to welcome everybody here today. This is such an exciting topic that I sure do love talking about. I'm so glad I get to share the stage with Kim Dittus today. Absolutely wonderful. So really, let's talk about processed foods and how that affects us when we're trying to do better or on our path to wellness, we'll call it. When I think about processed foods, I think about things that I would like to start to take out of our diets. And how do we do that? How do we practically get that done? So the things that I think about are, well, when I'm cooking, when I start to cook for myself, that I actually put myself in the driver's seat of those foods, meaning that I'm in control of putting the amounts of sugar or salt or fat. So that's why when I focus on talking about food and about teaching food is I want to talk about the whole food. And when we cook with the whole food, we really end up with a far better product because we control the amount of things that we put into that food. Next slide.
All right, so where does the problem come in? So, there's the washed spinach. That's by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's definition, processed, but I used washed leafy greens all the time. Same thing with the can of beans. I don't always cook my beans from scratch, so that can is pretty much the beans and not a whole lot else added. Where the problem comes in is with ultra processed food. And these are foods that go through multiple process steps, including extrusion and heating, and it comes out looking like something that it never looked like in the first place. So it's highly manipulated. It has many ingredients, and many of those ingredients are names that you do not recognize as food. Sadly, in the United States and actually in Canada as well, 50% of our calories come from these ultra-processed foods. And you'll see on the slide an example of an ultra-processed meal compared to an unprocessed. So with the ultra-processed, you've got your hot dogs, you've got your yogurt with sugar added, some chips and things like that. Whereas on the unprocessed side, you see a lot of greens and veggies and yes, some potatoes and some fish. And so the unprocessed side looks like a lot more food too. So that is appealing to me since I get hungry often. Next slide. So this is the only data that I'm going to show you today, but I think this is really important information. And so some researchers a few years ago took 20 people and they put them in a research center where they weren't going out and getting their own food. They had to stay there for 14 days. And they randomized half of them to get an ultra-processed diet, and that the slide before showed you one of an example meal from that, or an unprocessed diet. And these diets were presented ad libitum, meaning that people could choose what they wanted to eat, but they were matched in terms of carbohydrates and proteins and fats. And so they ate that for 14 days. And what they found out is that those individuals who were assigned the ultra-processed foods consumed 500 more calories a day. And within that 2-week period, they gained almost 2 pounds. And that's only 14 days. So that's a huge amount. And so you can see over time what impact the ultra-processed food can have. And if you remember back to that very first slide, excess weight is something that we want to avoid in terms of cancer. Next slide. So what's the problem with these ultra-processed foods? So they're very low in nutritional value. They have little, if any, of those phytonutrients. So when you hear on the news or read about some magical thing in green tea or pomegranate or some other whole food like that, it's usually the phytonutrients that are beneficial in terms of preventing cancer. And so processed food takes those out for the most part. It contributes to weight gain. And processed food tends to have the 3 ingredients that contribute to overeating, like sugar, salt, and fat. Next slide. So we're going to start with sugar, and this is a common question. Does sugar cause cancer? There's no data that sugar preferentially feeds cancer. All of the cells in our body use sugar. But there's a little bit of data that a sugar-enriched diet promotes breast tumor growth, including in metastatic sites. Now that was in mice. However, if you sort of dialed that up to the amount that a human would eat, it could get close if all you did is consume a very, very sugary diet. Also, we know that sugary soft drinks, that consumption is associated with increased risk of 11 types of cancer. But more importantly, likely anyway, is that excess sugar consumption, excuse me, contributes to weight gain. Next slide. So where's this sugar coming from? So on average in the United States, we consume about 20 to 23 teaspoons of added sugar a day. For women, that shouldn't be more than 6 teaspoons. Sorry. And that most of that comes from soda, energy drinks, and sports drinks. Second would be grain-based desserts. Next slide. Leah, what options do you have for sugar?
Yes, so sugar. A few things I like to first talk about with sugar. One of them is what we call the dessert flip. So the dessert flip is something that I like to focus on. And that could be something as, because, hey, we all like chocolate. We do like to have a little yum after dinner, or we want to have something that is special. And there is only good that comes from something special. So instead of maybe having that very large brownie with a scoop of ice cream and maybe some chocolate sauce and a little whipped cream with a little cherry on top, we can kind of think about flipping that around. And so what I like to do with the idea of the dessert flip, is that I like to use maybe unnatural sugar, which would be fruit. So taking our fruit, and we can marinate the fruit with a little bit of lemon juice and maybe a little bit of maple syrup, because that would be a natural sugar instead of using a processed sugar. And also the nice idea of using a maple syrup or a honey is that we're also using the flavor of that item instead of it just being straight sugar, which usually only brings sugar or sweetness to something. So I always like to give it a little extra added punch when we're using something like sugar. So we have those raspberries, they're marinated with a little bit of the maple syrup and the sugar, and then we can put that into a bowl and dollop with a little bit of a Greek full-fat Greek yogurt, and maybe put a little bit of a dollop of we can use a little orange marmalade. Maybe we can do a little chocolate syrup, because we still can, there's nothing wrong with having some chocolate, or maybe even shaving some chocolate on top of that. So thinking ways of taking a look at that dessert and making it a little more nutritious, a little more balanced, and using that sugar that actually has more benefit to us. Next slide.
All right, I'm back and hopefully not coughing. It's so nice to be able to like step away and come back. You certainly couldn't do that on something other than a webinar. All right, so the second ingredient that contributes to overconsumption, or can, is salt. So excess intake of salt and salty food is associated with increased risk of GI tract cancers. So there is some link to cancer. And lowering salt can decrease blood pressure. The link to cardiovascular disease is a little bit less clear. But excess salt can contribute to loss of bone density, and that's really important for postmenopausal women who tend to lose bone density slowly over time. And some women who with breast cancer may be on medications that even accelerate that a little bit faster. So where does this salt come from? So 77% comes from processed and prepared foods. So if we were to just limit that, then we would get down a lot more easily towards that 1 teaspoon that we should be consuming a day. And so what we add in cooking, or add a little bit while we're eating, or from natural sources, wouldn't be a problem for the vast majority of us. But salt's important for cooking. Next slide.
All right, so let's talk about salt. A lot of times people will say, chefs, they oversalt everything. And it's true. And you would sometimes think that they say if you saw salt on the table, that would be a no-no because the chef salted it just for you. But we have to kind of step back and think about that. Actually, again, when we come back to this whole food, cooking with whole food idea, and that we're in the driver's seat and we get to add what we need to do, is a lot of times what I like to do is I will create a meal and I will have the salt on the table because I would like the person who is enjoying that meal to salt it for themselves. Let them be in control of what they need to make that dish delicious. The other thing is that when we're thinking about salt in cooking, is that salt not only is a chemical, because we can use it for brines and we can use it for, for cures, but the other thing that salt does is that it takes flavor and it brings it back into focus. Because a lot of times, and I'll give you a great example as my watermelon demo, and maybe some of you have seen this that I have done at a few of the other conferences in the past, is I take 3 pieces of watermelon, I place them on a plate, and I put a wedge of lime and a little bit of sea salt. And what I like to do is I like to share this with participants to really give the example of why salt is important in cooking. So the first thing, and you can do this at home the next time you have some watermelon because it is watermelon season. What we can do is first have your guest or maybe yourself take that piece of watermelon, place it in their mouth and have them experience that watermelon plain. And a lot of times I like to ask the participants, hey, how did that taste to you? What does watermelon make you feel like? And a lot of people will say, oh, summer, or it's juicy, refreshing. And then usually I do get somebody in the crowd who says, I don't like watermelon, but that's okay. This is for science. Now, we're going to now take the second piece of watermelon. And to that second piece, what we're going to do is we're going to add the addition of just a little piece of salt on it, just a few flakes, not a lot, just a few. And then I have the participant experience the watermelon with just a little bit of the salt. And then I ask them, how does that taste? And usually what will happen is they'll say there was a burst of moisture because that's the science of salt. Salt is drawing the moisture out of the watermelon. So you get that bright burst of juiciness and the watermelon. And it is very common to salt watermelon just to get that experience. So the third part, which is the piece de resistance, where I really get to show why salt is important, is I have them take that little lime wedge, squeeze an ample amount of lime juice on it, place a little more salt on top of the watermelon, and then have them enjoy that bite. And what happens is that all of a sudden the salt, the sweet of the watermelon, the tanginess of the lime juice all comes together and creates this almost natural explosion of flavor in your mouth. And that is a perfect example of why salt is important, because it takes that flavor and it heightens it. But yet again, to really remember that when we are cooking with whole foods, because that's the most important, that we are in the driver's seat. We're in the driver's seat with the salt, and that's how we can control it. And that's why I will always say whole food is better. Next.
And as someone who dislikes watermelon, when you put that salt on the watermelon with the lime, even people who don't like watermelon will like watermelon. All right, finally, the fat piece. Did we get things wrong? Did scientists get things wrong about fat? And I guess the answer to that would be yes and no. This is a picture from the cover of Time from a long time ago, a number of years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago. It says, eat butter. Scientists, I can't even read it with my glasses, sorry. Scientists said that fat was wrong, why they were bad, why they were wrong is what the subtitle says, sorry. And so that's partially true. And so when we started to make these links with fat and health problems, we weren't separating out trans fats from the other fats. It was all lumped into saturated fat. And what we found over time is that trans fats are clearly unhealthy. And trans fats are those fats where you take a liquid form of a fat and make it into a solid form by processing. Sort of still coming back to processing probably isn't such a great idea. So trans fats are clearly unhealthy. And as of January 1st this year, they are banned, and so they shouldn't be available. Saturated fats, it's less clear. If someone has cardiovascular disease, I still would be concerned about too much saturated fat. Now, what about oils? I think everybody knows that omega-3 fatty acids have benefits, and it has benefits for cardiovascular disease and some suggestion that there's benefits for cancer as well. Omega-6 fatty acids are probably healthy. That's a little bit less clear, and maybe there's an issue with the balance. Maybe we have too much omega-6 compared to omega-3. And then finally, does it come, this is the one thing I like to think about, is my oil, is it coming from a source that you can get oil out of easily? So think about fatty foods like olive oil, avocado oil, nuts, seeds. I'm not sure it's very easy to get oil out of a kernel of corn. So that's one, the corn oil, I tend not to select. Next slide. But there are a lot of healthy fats, and Leah's going to tell us about how to use them.
Absolutely. So, fat. One of the things I always like to say is that fat is flavor. And the reason why fat is flavor is that for all of the wonderful spices and herbs to do their job, they actually need fat. And the process we use in cooking is we call it blooming. So or infusing, blooming or infusing, either one of those words will work. So let's take curry, for example. Curry is this wonderful, spicy, orange, just wonderful spice. And it needs to be paired with fat so that it can bloom and to really give that wonderful flavor of curry, to really let it shine, because spices are fat soluble. So without the fat, we're never going to get all of the flavor that we're looking for. So don't shy away from using a little bit of olive oil or butter to get those really delicious flavors. Just remember, if fat is flavor, then moderation is king. Now, to go into the other topic that always comes up with fat, and in any cooking class, I definitely talk about this, is the whole confusion about extra virgin olive oil. Now, extra virgin olive oil, all of a sudden in the 90s, actually maybe even into the 80s, it just became it just was all over the place. Extra virgin olive oil everywhere. And people started cooking with it in all sorts of things. But usually, like most things, there was a lot of people using it before the education kind of came out about extra virgin olive oil. So basically, what I always like to remind people is there's a few points about cooking with extra virgin olive oil. First of all, extra virgin olive oil is a low heat oil, meaning that it has a burning point, meaning that it will burn very quickly. And when we burn that oil, meaning, let's think of our saute pan, we're going to place it on top of some heat, right? And we put our extra virgin olive oil in, and all of that direct heat, it starts to burn all of the fresh fruits from the olives that are left in the oil because it's the first pressing. So when we have that heat and it's burning, and it will basically burn all that delicious flavor right out of the oil. So the few things that I like to think about is, first, it's like throwing money out the door, because that really nice big tall bottle of olive oil, it's pretty expensive. Secondly, flavor. We've taken that flavor and we've burned it away. And thirdly, there's also the health component. Now, you definitely have to drink a whole bunch of burnt extra virgin olive oil for it to actually maybe affect you, but you do have to remember you're creating free radicals that your body really can't handle. So remember, slow and low with extra virgin olive oil. You want to take care of it. And when I use extra virgin olive oil, I like to use it for salad dressings, for finishing soups, for marinating or grilling. These are wonderful things for that oil. Now, there is just regular olive oil, and regular olive oil is usually around the second or third pressing. So that means all of that fruit flavor from the olives is gone. So that means we won't have that. It's a higher heat point. So then we can add a little more heat to it. Another question that comes up a bunch is, well, can I put extra virgin olive oil on my vegetables when I roast them? Absolutely. This is, of course, there's always the exception to the rule. And why is because when we roast our vegetables at high heat with extra virgin olive oil and maybe a little salt and pepper and some herbs, is that in our oven, it's actually indirect heat. It's not that pan on top of flame. It's the sheet pan in the oven with the heat that's kind of circulating around it. So it actually never gets hot enough for the oil on the surface to actually burn. So please continue to roast those vegetables with the extra virgin olive oil, because that really is the best way. Some other things to think about with oils is that their shelf life, especially the more finishing oils such as walnut oil, sesame oil, olive oil. So basically think of any oil that has a flavor. These have shelf lives. They actually also like to be kept in the fridge because they can go rancid rather quickly. And a good rule of thumb with a oil that has flavor is that it usually means it has a low smoke point. So don't use it in high heat cooking methods. So a lot of times people think when they're sauteing then they're making their stir fry, that they'll stir fry in sesame oil. And actually that's not a good idea because the sesame oil will burn. Use that sesame oil at the end of your stir fry, just so you can get that wonderful flavor of the sesame oil. All right, next slide.
So I just have a couple more things to say about fat. I don't know if you saw my head nodding as Leah was talking. But fat also helps to extract the health benefits of things like turmeric. So, and the other thing about fat is it provides satiety. And so a lot of people are concerned about switching to a whole food plant-based diet, that they're going to be hungry all the time. But fat really helps with the satiety piece to it. So we talked a lot about the processed foods and the issues with that. So what should we be eating? We should be eating whole foods and mostly plants. And Michael Pollan, I think, said it best. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And that kind of summarizes all of it. And it's sort of the doing piece of that that's the complicated part. Next slide. So why are whole foods so beneficial? So these are the foods that are high in nutrient content. So the things that we know we need to have, like vitamins and minerals, vitamin C. They're also the ones that are rich in antioxidants. So we do make some free radicals. So we want some antioxidants around to help us control that. They're the ones that are rich in phytochemicals. So those compounds that have cancer preventing and fighting benefits. They're typically low in calories compared to processed food. So they fill you up without a lot of caloric density. And it improves the outcomes of all chronic diseases. And it replaces the food-like substances that is essentially ultra-processed food with something that is much healthier. And that picture on the bottom is just a reminder that we want to eat the rainbow of colors. Next slide. So who should be eating this type of diet, a whole food diet? And the answer is everyone. And I couldn't find masks with people who are appropriately social distance. So this was the best I could do. But I think it's really important to think about that there is not a specific diet for this cancer or that cancer or cancer overall. And it's really important to remember that the most common cause of death for women with an early stage breast cancer is not breast cancer, it's cardiovascular disease. So it's really important to think about what other chronic diseases you might have and think about the health benefits of modifying your diet for those reasons as well. Next slide. So another question about switching to more of a plant-based diet is this question about protein, because I think when we grew up, we thought of protein as being so important. And it definitely is important, but you need to remember that plants contain all the proteins that animals do. Where do you think those animals got their protein? They got their protein from the plants. And so something else we were all taught, I think, in home ec and other venues is that if you're eating a vegetarian diet, you need to somehow be careful about how you combine your protein so you get enough protein. It was thought that you needed to have these complementary proteins in the same meal, like the protein in whole wheat bread and the protein in peanut butter. It turns out it doesn't have to be in the same meal. So that is old and misinformation. And then another question I get frequently is what about soy protein? Because soy protein contains phytoestrogens that might be a concern for people with breast cancer or prostate cancer. And it turns out that soy food actually might be beneficial both for preventing breast cancer in the first place and preventing recurrence. But we don't know that's true about soy supplements. And so when you concentrate what's in that whole food into a supplement, who knows? So we would not recommend soy supplements, but soy food is okay. Next slide. So Leah's going to talk about all the awesome protein alternatives that we have.
First of all, I love this. I love this slide. Beautiful slide. Shows the first thing about the beans and the legumes is that there is a variety of them. And that, to me, variety is the spice of life, correct? So when I see a product like the, legumes and beans, I just think about all the different things I can do with them. Recently, just to get on a little side note, it's actually, I think, one of the recipes that's on the resource page, is I've been getting really into using some yellow lentils. And I also have kind of been getting a little bored with hummus, because it seems like hummus is everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere to a point where now there's dessert hummus. So I know I needed to find a new dip here. So recently I've been making this curry red lentil dip. And the other great thing about it is that it's cheap. And the other wonderful thing about beans and legumes, they're shelf stable, whether they're dry or in a can. So definitely take a look at that red lentil dip. It's delicious, and it definitely is a great spin on the good old hummus. Even though hummus is great, keep eating it, it's wonderful. But back to the beans and legumes. So like I said, variety, tons of them, all sorts, shelf stable, wonderful for your pantry. Great if you're wanting to, and great if you're trying to build that pantry up, to always have those on hand, because we don't always need to focus on having a protein come from meat. We can also start to focus on having the protein come from our beans and legumes. Now, after that, they're also cheap. I've said that again, they're cheap, and they can either be dried or canned. Let's talk about dried versus canned, because this is a question that comes up a whole bunch. I loved canned beans because it's the easiest way to get the bean into my system. A lot of people say, "Oh, I don't do beans because that means there's such a hassle. I have to take the bag, I have to soak them, I have to first I have to remember to soak them, and if I do even remember to soak them, do I even have time to let those cook?" Well, that's fine, because beans in a can are just fine. The only thing I'd like people to do is please rinse the goo that the beans are stored in, because when we talk about beans kind of disrupting our belly a little bit and maybe there's some gas involved, it's because usually it's from that lovely goo that they sit in. So rinse your beans. They'll always treat you right. If you are going to soak your beans and cook them, definitely do it. It's wonderful if you have the time. You just have to remember to, yet again, that soaking liquid that they have sat in overnight, please disregard that, get rid of it, and start with fresh water right before you cook them. So that is my thing on beans and legumes. Definitely get them into your diet. I love them. They're just wonderful. Next slide.
Yeah, and another thing I'd say about the beans and legumes is lentils cook up fast. So those are a great way to start with legumes. And the other thing is, I'm starting to love my Instapot. Leah, what do you think of the Instapot? Just real quick.
I love my Instapot. I am not a gadget gal, but I will tell you the two new gadgets that I have, and it's bizarre because they all came this year, my Instapot, and I like my air fryer. And I also have a dual one, so it's an air fryer and a convection oven and a Cuisinart. It's amazing. Makes the best French fries without any of the extra added fat. So I'm loving it.
Very cool. All right. So what about grains? So grains and carbohydrates in particular have been vilified over the last few years. And I think that that's starting to go away. But it's really important to remember that carbohydrates, that's what should make up the most of your diet. Not protein or fat, it's carbohydrates. So we need to get in healthy carbohydrates. And so we would want to look for whole grains, because it's the whole grain, the bran and the germ that contains the nutrients. So the germ has a lot of B vitamins and vitamin E and some of those phytochemicals. The bran has some of the vitamins and minerals also, but also has the fiber. So you're really wanting to look for the whole grain that has all the edible parts, bran, germ, and the endosperm, which is the refined part of it. Next slide. All right, how are we going to do that?
All right, so yet another beautiful slide of gorgeous grains. Look at those lovely grains, beautiful. All right, so yet again, beans are kind of like, beans and grains, definitely some of my favorite things. I will say something I cook a lot at home is beans, greens, and grains. So when I put those three things together, it's quite the balanced meal. Again, just like beans, there is a variety of grains. A lot of times people will say, well, I don't like cooking grains because it's so complicated. Well, I'd like to tell everybody that cooking, yes, is hard, absolutely, but there are a few things to remind yourselves. With grains, it's always a 2-to-1 ratio. A lot of times you'll see, oh, maybe it's a quarter, 1 and 3 cups versus this, that they start to kind of make the ratios a little complicated. So just remember, 2 parts water, 1 part grain. And that is for our rice, that is for our quinoa. Now, when we're thinking of a barley or a farro, I like to cook those like I cook pasta. So it's usually 4 times the amount of water to 1 cup of the grain. And I let them cook boiling, boiling, boiling until they start to soften, get a little al dente, and then I pour them out and rinse them. And that's how I'll use something like farro and barley, because they take a little bit longer, and the pasta cooking method is the definite best way of doing it. When we're thinking about grains and we're thinking about pasta and breads, sometimes people are like, oh, I don't want to eat bread, and they vilify gluten and things of that nature. But remember, if we are going to eat those things, you want to find nutritional, they want to have a real nutritional value. So using a whole grain pasta is definitely one of those really smart moves, because you're still getting the pasta, but you're also getting the nutritional value of having the whole grain. Quinoa is something you'll start to see everywhere. I love quinoa. You can find quinoa in all different colors. There's a multicolored quinoa, black, red, white. It's wonderful. It's also gluten-free. So it lends to so many things. I like to put a handful in my soups. I like to cook it off on Sundays and have it for the week, and I put it on top of my salads, or I heat it up with some vegetables, being part of my beans, grains, and greens. That's something that, just a good prep ahead is good for grains. Let me see, what else can I think about grains? Well, variety, like I said, tons of them. They're good value. I like to buy them in bulk. Because yet again, this is something that's shelf stable and that we can have in our pantry. I like to think of the things that are actually rather healthy for us do come in, they're shelf stable and they last. So always remember, when we are prepping that pantry, grains should definitely be highlighted there. Next slide.
So this is a slide more for Leah as well, but I think what she just said really is the answer to this conundrum. Salads just don't fill me up. And that is combining the beans, greens, and grains, and protein as well as fat contribute to satiety. So Leah, any other good advice for making that transition so we're not hungry?
Absolutely. So it's true. A lot of times when people are on their path to wellness, they say, oh, I just eat a whole lot of salad. And yes, that can get rather boring. But I look at the salad, I like to compose the salad. So I like to create a nourish bowl out of that salad. So that means I want to build balance at it. So I like to use those greens. And when we're building that balanced nourish bowl, think about the brighter the green, the better. So all the different varieties of greens like baby kale, spinach, Swiss chard, even romaine, all of those things can go in there. Something else to think about that I like to do is I'll throw herbs into my salads as well, because that has a lot of phytonutrients that we're looking for too. So basil, mint, you could use a little bit of oregano, or even the celery tops. When you get a head of celery and there's the beautiful celery tops, a lot of people chop those off and throw them away. That's actually lovely. I pick those off and throw them into the salad greens as well. So your base is full of delicious flavor. Now onto that base, what we can do is, like we're talking about, we have beans. So pick a bean. Maybe I like chickpeas because chickpeas are nice and they have a really good texture and they hold up well and marinate well. We were talking about farro. Farro is great as a grain, especially onto a salad, because they're chewy and they have a wonderful nutty flavor. And then let's think about the rainbow of vegetables that we can choose. And when we're building this, when we're looking at our vegetables, I also like to kind of, step up my veggie game a bit too. If I have broccoli or green beans, sometimes I'll blanch those just to kind of bring them a crispness, and some more green color. So it's a little more palatable. Grated carrots, grated beets, pickled onions. Because then at that point, I also like fruit, maybe some blueberries or some strawberries. What else can we put on this? Well, now let's get into the protein realm. Also, put some hard-boiled egg or maybe some flake salmon. There's so many different ways to really build that nourish bowl. So the next time you look at your salad, think of all the different ways you can put some, color, texture, deliciousness, flavor, and then of course to top everything off, the dressing. Let's talk about dressings. I almost forgot to talk about this. Kim, this would have been bad. Now, dressings, usually you'll open your refrigerator door and you'll look at the side of the door and there's probably around 5 or 6 different types of dressings. Here's the thing. A dressing could be as simple as extra virgin olive oil and lemon juice with a little bit of salt. That is a dressing. But you can also do what I like, and there's a bunch of the recipes that are in the resources for some homemade dressings, is I have a few mason jars that have different flavored dressings that I make weekly. So say you can have your mason jar, you put your vinegar of choice, your emulsifier of choice, and your oil of choice. Then you can flavor it by maybe adding some spices or some fresh herbs and just give it a shake. And that will bring everything together to make a delicious dressing. It will, first of all, really help you in your first steps of trying to get processed foods out by making your own dressing. It will also help with waste, and it will also be something that you can just take out of the fridge and be ready to go. Because I will usually make these nourish bowls and I'll bring them to work and I just bring my mason jar with me and then I dress everything up and ready to go. So definitely take a look at those recipes that are on the resource page. They're quite good and they really will help you on that path to get those processed foods out.
And making the dressing is so fast, but there's another thing that I want you to us to remember to talk about, and that is nuts, because I like having some nuts on my Buddha bowls, nourish bowls as well. And I know that you have a good take on nuts as well.
Thank you, Kim, for reminding me. Nuts, another idea, another in that nice path to wellness when we start to think about trying to get certain processed foods out. I always like to remind people, what kind of nuts do you like? And they usually say, oh, salted peanut or maybe a candied pecan. But really, when we're buying nuts that are already processed, their nutrition value is not as good as they should be. So what I suggest is to buy raw nuts, meaning nothing has done to them except that they've come out of their shell. So let's take the walnut. Buy some walnuts. When you go home, and this will be another fun little thing that you can do, kind of like the watermelon demo. Preheat your oven at 350, take a sheet tray, put on some of the walnuts, keep a few walnuts aside so you can do a little comparison afterwards, and toast those walnuts for 5 to 7 minutes. I will tell you, nuts will let you know when they're ready, because all of a sudden, as soon as you smell the nuts toasting, they are done. Don't wait for the timer, just take them out. So when you take out those roasted nuts, what I'd like you to do, of course, let them cool down a little bit. But once they cool down, I would like you to try a raw nut, the raw walnut first, try it, see how you like it, and then compare it to the toasted walnut. It is quite amazing what the addition to heat does to a nut. Because what it does is it starts to draw out the wonderful flavor, which if we remember from when we were talking earlier, is that where the flavor is in the fat. So in the oils of that walnut is where all that wonderful flavor lives. So just by the addition of heat, we have created this crunchy, delicious walnut just by heat. You could do this with pepita seeds, you could do this with pecans, you could do this with sunflower seeds. Any of those things will always like to have a little heat to them so that you can really taste what they have to offer without all that salt and sugar. Next slide.
Thank you. All right, so how much of these veggies and fruit should we be eating on a regular basis? So there was a really interesting study in 2017. Now this is an epidemiologic study looking at how people eat and how healthy they were based on what they were consuming. And it turned out that those individuals who consumed 800 grams of vegetables and fruit a day had decreased incidence of cardiovascular disease, decreased incidence of cancer, and overall were living longer. And so what does 800 grams look like? And that's sort of illustrated on those plates down there. So that would be 800 grams a day. And so there's a nutritionist from Optimize Me Nutrition that started this thing called the 800 gram challenge, which I thought was particularly interesting. So I want to give her credit for that. But her challenge is for people to get up to eating 800 grams of vegetables a day. And so maybe you're not quite starting out that way, but that would be the eventual goal. And if you're having breakfast, so you've got the avocados and you've got some berries, but I don't know about you, I put a lot of salsa on my eggs, and that definitely counts as a vegetable. Or if I have some leftover, especially leftover zucchini grilled up or stir fried up from the day before, I make like an egg scramble with those vegetables. So you definitely can get vegetables in with your breakfast. And so you don't want to just have, though, 800 grams of carrots or 800 grams of potatoes. You want to have a variety. And so another study that was published in 2018 suggested that 30 different plant species in a week contributed to gut health. It would be a challenge for me probably to get 30 different plant species, but if I started incorporating different legumes and things like that, those are plants as well, and other grains, quinoa, so definitely plants. So I think maybe 30 different plant species a week isn't out of the realm of possibility. Next slide. So this is again back in Leah's court. How do we get from that hot dog and a hamburger to that beautiful bowl with all of those veggies in it? And I have not had lunch, and so this is making me so hungry.
So when we want to make this transition, because this transition can be quite daunting, and to remember, like I said earlier, is that cooking is hard. That's just, there's no silver bullet, just like dieting is hard, or whatever our path is, whatever we're trying to change, it is hard. And a lot of times I like to use Facebook as a reference to this, is when you see all those tasty videos and see all those little onions and they're dancing around and jumping into a pot, and then all of a sudden there's this glorious soup that was just made in 5 seconds. That is not cooking. That is giving us a false perception of how easy cooking can be. So I really like to, when I teach patients and when I'm doing research, I really like to remind people that small changes is how we make it. If we can say, hey, maybe, like we use the example of the salted peanut, if I could say, hey, maybe I'll buy raw peanuts and I'll toast them up and eat them that way instead of having the salted peanut from the store, maybe that's my small change. Or the next time I make scrambled eggs, like Kim was talking about, maybe I'll add some spinach to it. And hey, I do like pesto. Pesto can be on pasta, but pesto can also be in eggs. So trying to think of those small things. Or hey, maybe we have a hard time with trying to quit drinking soda. I like to take a little bit of juice or kombucha, maybe just 2 ounces worth, and then add seltzer to that. Maybe add some, little bit of raspberries into it to make it fun. But try to think of things outside of the box. Think of the small changes that we can make. Think of, hey, instead of the iceberg lettuce, maybe I'll try spinach. Maybe I don't like broccoli, but maybe I could blanch the broccoli and maybe I like it cooked instead of raw. Maybe if I try 1 time a week to cook a full meal from scratch, is better than not doing it at all. So remember, one step in front of the other, look at your resources, remind yourself that this is hard, but it is totally possible and the benefits are going to be big. So trust yourself, feel safe to get back in the kitchen, and really just continue to think about all the fun things that you can start to do for your health. Next slide.
All right, so I want to end with a question, and that question is, how do you run a marathon? So next slide. You run a marathon 1 foot in front of the other. And so I think it's important to stay accountable, to keep thinking about what changes you can do and add to the small changes, and those changes get bigger, and you start to gain confidence. But it's really important to focus on the process of changing your diet, not necessarily on the outcome. So that is where we would like to end this before we open things up for questions. So there are a few questions in the question and answer, and we're going to try to get to those. So one question had to do with an example of oil that you like to use for cooking on the stovetop, Leah, that has a higher flash cook point.
Great question. I should have talked about it earlier, but it slipped my mind. So what I do like to use is I like to use either an avocado oil or a canola oil. The other thing I will do is I will blend my regular olive oil with canola oil or avocado oil just to kind of to stretch it, and it gives a little more flavor. But any of those higher heat oils are good for regular saute. Good question.
All right, another question has to do with stevia. And so stevia is from a leaf, and it doesn't have the calories that other sugar has. It has a sweet taste, I think a slightly licoricey taste. I use it sometimes. I don't cook with it. I don't think you can cook with it. I don't know of any research to suggest that it is inherently bad. Leah?
I have to say with stevia, it's really the taste that gets most people, that they sense that licorice flavor, and can be a little off-putting. But I will say for people who are trying to kind of stay away from that and still likes a little bit of sweetness in their beverage, it is quite good in coffee and teas. For cooking or baking, it's not something that I use because it can become very acrid once heat is added to it. So it's something I tend to stay away from. I'd rather use a maple syrup or a molasses or, something that lends better flavor to things.
Yeah, and I like it sometimes in yogurt. So I always get plain yogurt, or another thing I've been doing in my Instapot is making my yogurt. But then I don't add, I really dislike the yogurt you buy in the store with the sugar added. I can add some stevia to yogurt, and if there's a lot of other things in there, I get a little bit of sweetness. Or the other thing I would do is add a little bit of jam to my yogurt instead as well. But that's the yogurt you don't cook, so the stevia can blend well in that. So another question was about these 800 grams. So what is that equivalent to? So it's not quite 8 to 9 cups. It is about your fist. So a serving about, if you would have about a fist size, 8 fist size of veggies and fruit, that is about 8 to 9 cups. And I'm not talking though about like packing all of your spinach into a fist. So I mean so it's not quite as dense as it sounds. See if there's other questions here.
I like this steamed vegetable question.
Oh, yes.
Let's find that one. So
yeah, so steamed vegetables, so there's this idea that cooking removes nutrients, and vitamin C is a little bit more delicate compared to others, but if something is not boiled, if you don't boil the heck out of your vegetables, you're going to maintain the nutrients and the phytonutrients. And if that's something that helps with the flavor, and you then have in the refrigerator to be able to pull out later to make into some meal, I think that's a great idea. Leah?
Couldn't agree more. I find, and actually steaming, I usually tend to use steaming for if I'm going to eat something directly. I use blanching for if I was going to be putting up for the week. So blanching, just a quick refresher, blanching is a very large pot of boiling water with the addition of a little bit of salt. We add in, say, broccoli or green beans or asparagus for what I like to say the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 count out. So 5 seconds in the boiling water, and then I directly plunge that into either cold water or cold water with ice. That is a really good way to preserve the vegetable and that crunch and the deliciousness for a longer period of time. With steaming sometimes breaks down the vegetables a little too much, so usually the next day they're a little bit more mushy. So blanching is definitely something that I like to do for prepping ahead, steaming for directly eating.
Yeah, and so someone brought up I'm going to combine kind of 2 questions. I think they're good questions. We haven't talked a lot about dairy. So we were really focusing on plants today. This idea of dairy products maybe not being so beneficial from a health perspective, there's a little bit of data to suggest that milk does increase risk of breast cancer in particular a little bit, but that doesn't seem to be the case with yogurt or cheeses, and that's probably because of the fermenting process that goes on with yogurt and cheeses. So yogurt and cheese, I wouldn't have a problem with at all, and that contributes some of the good healthy fermented things that we're finding out are good for gut health. But I do limit my milk intake a little bit. So in terms of other plant-based milks, I think any of them are okay. They don't seem to have as much protein as dairy milk, but you can get protein in other ways as well. So I think whatever flavor of plant-based milk you prefer is fine. And if you're not drinking gallons of milk a day, that's probably all right as well. And then related to that is this sort of idea about non-fat versus full-fat dairy. So the fat in dairy products probably is not quite as bad as we thought. I mean, tends to be a saturated type fat, but I'm less concerned about that. And for sure, in terms of butter, I don't even think you can buy margarine anymore, can you? I would much rather have that flavor of butter in a full fat way. And the full fat yogurt definitely is creamier.
I would have to agree. I definitely am leaning far more into the full fat yogurts and dairies. If you're going to have butter, I think you can still get country crock, which if you're going to have a spreadable fat, then you might as well just enjoy the butter. And just like I said, it's all about moderation, and fat is definitely is flavor. So and I love full fat Greek yogurt. I bake with it, I cook with it. It's probably it's the thing that I use the most. I will this other question about tempeh being considered a processed food. It is, yes, it is processed in the aspect that we have to prepare to make it, because there's a lot of process to it, but it's not a bad processed food. It is just processed by its nature.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing with tofu. Now, if you take that tofu and make a fake hot dog out of it, that's processed. So there's a lot of good questions here, and I'm going to take a couple of them. One is would be a long response, and it has to do with excess weight. And so I think one of the things that is important about switching from a processed food diet to more of a plant-based diet is that there can be some weight loss associated with that. But it's also important to exercise. If any of you know me at all, I'm a big proponent of exercise. So there's a lot more to weight loss, but I really think it's important to bring that part back to that very last slide. And that is that it's really important to focus on the process of making changes, not on the end results, not on this idealized weight that one might want to be, because you're gaining health benefits by just modifying your food choices, even if the scale doesn't budge, or even if the scale only budges a small amount, that's still beneficial. So we will be, there's going to be a link to the resources on the website now, and then there will be an email link sent out to you, and our goal is to get to all of the rest of the questions and answer them and send that out with that email as well. So thank you for joining us. I had a great time. I love talking about food and cooking. Thank you so much, Leah. So have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you.